Sounds like
I was gonna say, almonds check. Social medicine, all of it.
Somebody coming to the Steel Center discussion today. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thank you for coming today. We're grateful to have Dr. Celeste Reeb, who is awesome, a film studies professor in the English department, and she's going to be talking about art as healing, which I've loved reading the description to my students. It seems so wonderful. So let's give Celeste a warm welcome.
My first instinct is to just start screaming and then leave. Sort of performance art. So I'm going to read, and for anybody who counts, there are 17 pages, but it's a very large font. So just if your calendar is like how close to the end are we? So howdy, good afternoon. I want to thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm going to thank the Steel Center for inviting me and for Tammy for making this all happen. I'm sure other people are involved, but Tammy, like, I don't think Hendrix runs without Tammy.
Sure.
Before we get started, I'm going to ask everybody, actually, if you could take out a piece of paper or bring up a notepad, and I'm going to give you 1 minute, and I want you to write down something that scares you. It doesn't have to be deep. It doesn't have to be existential. You're not going to have to share it. And it doesn't have to make sense to anybody but you. So I will give you a minute starting now. Or make a mental note. Really write it on the brain.
Just one thing?
You use this time however you need. As many things as you'd like. Thing that scares you. You have 30 more seconds. I like how many people are laughing as you're supposed to be writing down your deepest, darkest fears.
I think when faced with that which scares us, we have no option but to laugh and be upset.
Oh, don't take my talk, Frankie. Sorry. Time is up. Thank you so much. So excellent. We're now on a bit more equal footing. You have thought of something that scares you, and I'm doing something that I find utterly horrific, which is talking to other people. I'm both deeply scared of looking dumb, and because I have rumination OCD, I will replay this entire event over and over and over and over again until I scream. And if you catch me early enough in the parking lot, you might actually catch me screaming. I also have agoraphobia, which means every time I leave my house, I'm like 2 seconds away from a panic attack. I say all of this because I chose a profession that is in fact built on me frequently leaving the house and pretty much consistently talking to people while they stare at me, sometimes mouth open and one eye sort of drooping. It's one of the most horrific daily experiences I could have, and yet being a professor is also one of the most healing professions I could have, because the horrific is often healing. The original title of this talk, by the way, was going to be Horror as is Through Healing. As indicates a kind of comparison or function of horror. Horror is like healing, and horror is a function of healing. Is indicates a verb of being, a relationship between a subject and a noun and an adjective. Horror is healing. Horror is a form of being for healing. And through is a preposition of movement. Horror and healing move through each other. I consider having you all diagram sentence trees in order to fully appreciate the dilemma I was faced with. And then I realized that grammar trees are actually their own form of horror. I will not inflict on you. Now that I've acknowledged this talk is sort of haunted by a never realized version of itself, I'll tell you what we're actually going to do. First, I'm gonna give her, oh yeah. Nope. Great. I'm gonna do these things. I'm gonna give a very, very brief timeline of American horror. Then we're gonna think about why horror. I'm gonna give you a very fake taxonomy that I created in the past couple of weeks about horror and healing. It does not cover everything, but I hope it gives us a better sense of where horror and healing happen. Lastly, I'll draw attention to the way that the healing process itself is kind of horrific, one that we don't often talk about publicly. In the end, I hope that I can draw attention to how something that seems so macabre can actually be a place of joy. So my very, very oh so brief timeline. Let me tell you. In the 30s and 40s, we have sort of universal monsters. So we're thinking Dracula, we're thinking Creature from the Black Lagoon. In the 50s, we have atomic horror. So Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Attack of the 50-Foot Ants. It's a lot of very large things. This really makes sense if you think about the fears present in the 50s. What happens when science goes unchecked? And horror becomes a way for us to work through unchecked science. In the 60s to 80s, we have a real shift, both because we have the death of sort of the production code, but also mass changes in civil rights, in who is considered a person, how they get to exist. All of our hopes, all of those figures that were meant to be the beacons of a new America are being assassinated. We have the Vietnam War. So the 60s to 80s really reflect this changing turmoil that's happening. The 90s, I don't know what's happening in the 90s with horror. 90s horror isn't quite sure. The Cold War's done. So rich people, I guess, is more sort of in the 90s. The 2000s is the birth, not necessarily the birth, but really the rise of what we would call gore porn. This is Hostel, this is Saw. And again, this makes total sense because the core of many of these films are human life is sacred. And if you leave the United States, you'll be murdered. And so the kind of xenophobia present in gore porn makes sense in a post 9/11 world. In the 2010s, we get this thing that I hate, which is everybody starts referring to art horror. A24 did not invent art horror, but this sort of turn to folk and nature-related horror makes sense in a world in which it does in fact feel like nature is oppressive towards us now, and that fear of our inability to master it. What I'm going to demonstrate with that sort of very brief timeline is that horror is often the place that is the best indicator of what we find horrific. So if these are the things that we're afraid of, why do we keep turning to them on a daily basis? Why horror? Why are we attracted to horror when it evokes feelings we often avoid in real life? Noel Carroll phrases this as, quote, how can horror audiences find pleasure in what by nature is distressful and unpleasant, end quote. Carroll argues that one reason is that we're attracted to the cognitive abilities. We're attracted to beings that are outside of our kinds of knowledge. We want to know how to categorize them and how to destroy them. Curiosity becomes sort of a guiding principle. Others would say Carroll doesn't account fully for things like rewatching horror or emotional impact, because there's only so much curiosity after your 50th watch of Slumber Party Massacre or Story Row Massacre or Prom Night 2, Hello Mary Lou, which I prefer over Prom Night 1. Curiosity left. Studies show that people rate a higher level of enjoyment with horror when they have experienced higher rates of negative affect, meaning negative emotions like fear or disgust. So we judge horror as pleasurable based on how unpleasant the experience was. We keep coming back to horror because through this cognitive curiosity, it helps us identify the edge and limits of our own knowledge. But it helps us to know ourselves. It forces us to experience our own existence. In this book, I think I was kind enough, yes, Recreational Terror, Women and the Pleasure of Horror Film Viewing, she breaks down sort of 5 functions. Horror disrupts the everyday. It transgresses and violates boundaries. It upsets the validity of the rational. It resists narrative closure, and it works to evoke fear. Well, sometimes the everyday world needs to be disrupted. For 2, When historically marginalized people are told that their existence is a transgression, then we want to see those boundaries violated. We want to see it burned. So I wish that hadn't been like the page turn. Rational is not always what we feel, and we want to see that reflected back to us. Narrative closure doesn't exist in our lives. They're messy and open. Fear can be productive and pleasurable. But how are those 5 things sort of working? My super made up, hopefully kind of makes sense taxonomy of horror that can be healing to different people. All right, so horror in children. I think children are horror, although that could be a separate conversation. An important genre for children to experience. Now, I'm not saying to show your 4-year-old niece The Exorcist, or as my mother did, a 7-year-old Event Horizon. But there is a reason children often play games or engage in things that scare them. It's not far from the reason that people skydive or rock climb. Doesn't Peekaboo show us that we have a compulsion to relive frightening experiences, to question our existence, to question what it means to be seen or have object permanence? At the end, to be reassured that we do exist and we can giggle, that we are seeable. Peekaboo shows us our desire to find pleasure in horrific situations. And yes, I did in fact Google how to play Peekaboo to ensure that that paragraph made sense. And I was adhering to the rules on Peekaboo. Horror importantly reaffirms that things are scary. That there are things in the dark that can hurt us. Children's horror lets them safely experience discomfort. And discomfort is vital for the development of self. Children experience fear and realize that in the end, they're okay. It gives them the space to feel badly and to cope with feeling badly. In that, it builds a sense of confidence. Feeling feels also builds empathy. It helps to build emotional regulation. Horror also provides them hope. Now, horror can serve didactic purposes, which is a fancy word of saying like it teaches us a lesson. Don't trust the wolf in the woods. Don't trust the white van with free candy spray painted on the side. What I think is so important is that everything that horror does for children are things that we need as adults too. So women in horror. I have 3 sort of subcategories of this. Women as and horror. Sorry, I really like a good sort of prepositional conjunctive. Many film theorists have questioned what do women see when they look at the screen? If the spectator and the screen are both assumed to be male, then what does a woman see? And why would women want to look at horror in which women are often looking at their own destruction? In her article, When the Woman Looks, Linda Williams argues that, quote, in the classic horror film, the woman's look at the monster offers at least a potentially subversive recognition of the power and potency of a non-phallic sexuality. Precisely because this look is so threatening to male power, it is violently punished, end quote. Both the woman and monster are punished because they cause anxiety in men. The monster displaces women as the site of spectacle, though. The monster is the source of unease and repulsion, and for once not the woman. Women may recognize this and recognize that they share a similar status. The woman can sympathetically identify and benefit from the monster. So often in daily life, women are painted as monsters. So when she looks and sees the screen, she can see how the world is often shaped in ways that make better to avoid men feeling anxious. The women in slashers. Often the subgenre of the slasher is considered unkind to women. Women die slower, longer, closer, and louder than men do in films and slashers. The girl who doesn't have sex, smoke, drink, who seems the smart one, makes it. Can we read this as anything other than a highly gendered way to reinforce being a good girl? The killer is almost always a large masked man holding a weapon that is never a gun. If the genre from Psycho to Texas Chainsaw Massacre to Nightmare on Elm Street seems to punish women, why do so many women love slashers? I don't believe it's just because of the existence of something like the final girl. I think there's something more visceral than that. In Hooper's 1974 film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the final girl, Sally, spends the last 30 minutes screaming. This is not an exaggeration. It is almost 30 minutes of screaming. She also jumps out 2 different windows, which serves no educational purpose. I just think it's slightly funny. That's it. Sally screams so long that you do start to wonder if she dies, the screaming stops. Women are often not supposed to take up space. People socialize as girls are told to be nice and to control themselves. Women in horror take up space. They scream. Have you ever inhaled so deep that you feel like you want to scream, but instead you swallow it down? Well, Sally doesn't swallow. She spits the scream out and she makes us take it. I can't help but to admire the scream queens. When we live in a culture in which 1 in 6 women are sexually assaulted, why wouldn't women want to scream? To hear that which they are told to control be so viscerally forced upon the public. Women in wombs. As more queer horror students know, they've had to hear me talk many times about womb phases. So horror often revolves around the fear of women. Even something like a haunted house is often an extension of the domestic, aka the woman, aka the womb. So much of horror reflects the horrificness of the womb phase itself. When Carrie White, in Carrie, has her period and is smearing blood on her peers in the locker room, we should reflect on the fact that there are bodies that just bleed regularly and painfully and sporadically. It's a normal thing bodies do. I mean, my favorite phrases are, in fact, boy howdy and bodies are leaky. But something can be both normal and horrifying. When Carrie White then burns down her high school prom after being doused in blood, after having puberty and menstruation and the shame of having those leaky bodies shoved violently upon her, a part of us can't sort of go, yeah, fair enough. While, of course, horror's positioning the womb space might reinforce the sexist structures around bodies, there's also something deeply refreshing about seeing these topics we shy away from put on display. So often do we demand that bodies be neat and orderly, to not be leaky. Horror is leaky. Women leak. Horror always, I don't know what the sun says. What I can tell you is that is the last time I'm going to say leak. Except for pregnant people leak. So they piss themselves. Sometimes they shit themselves. Things that may not have been a problem until pregnancy. People who are pregnant are told they're supposed to be glowing, be radiant, be magical. I hope that it is. But too often do we shame people who publicly discuss that pregnancy is in fact not all rainbows and kittens. Organs move in the body. Some people struggle to breathe. Food becomes an enemy. You feel something inside of you. Hair falls out. Bones move. Bones move. And while I need to preface what I'm about to say with the phrase Roman Polanski is a piece of shit, his film Rosemary's Baby so importantly reflects the horror of birth, the horror of wombs. Most importantly, the horror of not being able to make the choice about your womb. The film gives people the space to be angry about what they are and are not allowed to do with themselves. Horror is able to reflect back to people these deep parts, these secret parts that they're not allowed to say out loud, and in that it is a deeply validating experience. That's Carrie White as well. Trans horror. That validation that horror can provide for women in recognizing the horror of bodies and bodies is why trans people are also drawn to horror. More specifically, and this is not me saying all, but many trans people are drawn specifically to a subgenre known as body horror. Body horror is a type of horror that often focuses on disease, mutilation, decay, mutation, loss of control, general abnormality. So much language around bodies focuses on keeping sort of the sanctity of the body. Keep it clean, keep it thin, keep it adhering to clearly defined and easily readable gender performances. The body's a gift, value it. We also assume the body is a legible text that can be read. Trans bodies are a threat because they show that bodies are in fact malleable. They are flexible. They are changeable. Why fear? Because as soon as we start to point out the way in which sex and gender are just that, ideas, then what about everything else? What about sexual orientation? What about race? What about ability? What about citizenship? The body can be changed. It is not stable, and thus nothing is. It seems unsurprising then that people who do not fit neatly into gender binaries, who are told that there are natural and unnatural ways to have a body, would turn to a genre in which we get to see and get pleasure in seeing the body decimated. Trans director Jane Schoenberg says, quote, "I think trans people in general have planted their flag in the body horror genre. And I think there's good reason for that. We grow up with this complicated relationship to our own skin." And Cronenberg, who directed Videodrome, which you're seeing a picture here, Cronenberg, in all of his work, creates a language to talk about that in a horrifying but also kind of beautiful way. End quote. As horrific as body horror is, it is beautiful to get that validation. To have reflected back at you the struggle of when your own body is in fact the enemy. And we could spend a long time unpacking like this particular image, but we won't. But I think we all see it, right? Okay, queer horror. So Nielsen, who does a lot of like surveys on like how people consume media, they revealed that 43% of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender moviegoers report that the horror movie is their favorite genre to see. That is nearly 50% more than non-LGBT moviegoers. Queerness and horror have a lot in common. They both rely upon an existence outside of the linguistic order. They are embodied experiences that are fearful because they escape any type of easy confinement. Horror is horrific because it's felt rather than understood rationally. Just like pleasure, it is difficult to verbalize why something frightens us. There are plenty of theories, but at the end of the day, they're all just working to give language to something that's somewhat incomprehensible. Our belief that we can make fear understandable through language is a self-soothing tactic. To name it is to make it controllable. But certain horrors, certain pleasures are horrific and pleasurable because they escape the linguistic order. The same can be said for sexuality. Once sexuality is named, it can be controlled and used regardless if it's the dominant sexuality or not. So once sex becomes a discourse that is controllable and named through language, people will begin to surveil their own sexualities. They become their own prison guard, ensuring they meet all standards of normal. But of course, the trick is that normalcy needs the non-normal to exist at all. In a way, that's also what makes the queer monster powerful. Queer monsters often reveal the hidden mechanisms positioning heteronormativity as an unspoken power. I don't think all the pleasure is from watching sort of heteronormativity burn down in these films, but it's definitely part of it. The queer monster is powerful. Powerful in ways that are often denied to queer people themselves. As Carmen Maria Machado says, quote, "And yet, while I recognize the problem intellectually, the system of coding, the way villainy and queerness become a kind of shorthand for each other, I cannot help but to love these fictional queer villains. Their ruthlessness, their power. They are always by far the most interesting character on screen. After all, they live in a world that hates them. They've adapted, they've learned to conceal themselves, they've survived," end quote. If queer people are told they are the monsters, why wouldn't they celebrate Frankenstein's monster burning down the lab in Bride of Frankenstein? Why wouldn't they luxuriate in Daughters of Darkness' implication that lesbianism can never be killed? Why wouldn't they see themselves as Irina from Cat People, who, as my class showed, can be read as bisexual, lesbian, asexual, or a very wide range of genders? Who allows queer people to be empowered in their monstrosity and in a way that in real life gets them beaten and broken? So there's an old joke that in horror movies, the Black person dies first. And there have been several studies that try to see whether or not this is true, and there's conflicting evidence. But what this is really pointing to is the fact that horror films have often not treated Black characters or the concept of Blackness well. And I want to pause here to say that like Black people in horror, Black people watching horror, or films positioning Blackness as horrific are not new. Since the 1910s, there have been various horror films that intersect with Blackness. And even the concept of horror in relationship to Blackness can be understood through multiple lenses. Is Birth of a Nation, a film that shows racist depictions of Black people and helped invigorate the KKK, a horror film? According to Robin Coleman, she argues it's actually the first Black horror film in her book Black Noir. Often, horror Black characters are used to further the narrative of their white counterparts. If Blackness has historically positioned as scary to white people, then you're making a horror film and you need to show how scary the monster is, then you need the Black person to be shown as frightened of that monster, that something is scarier than they are. Or we also have the sacrificial Black person or the magical Black person who sort of sacrifices themselves or seems to magically know things that are going to help the white leads. I'm looking at you, Annabella, and Jeepers Creepers. So if the genre has been unkind to Black people or the concept of Blackness, what appeal is there? What healing is possible? Well, in Get Out, Them, Night of the Living Dead, we have something that many other genres fail to do. They paint white people as the monsters. Even 50-ish years later, Night of the Living Dead shows that one of the most dangerous things for a Black man is a white man with a gun. Often mainstream films are rooted in the past. Oh no, slavery was bad, that's sure sad, at least it's over. Only past white people are bad, as if there's no lingering effects to that. Horror is often able to articulate the history of Blackness and a history of Blackness in America as one rooted in horror. It is able to say that racism is not new, it is not the past, it continues to haunt us now. But not all horror films show the white characters as the villains. Some of the more popular horror films position Black characters as the source of fear, such as Candyman, Blackula, or Us. And I do want to pause here to say that despite the silliness of the name, Blackula is great and does a really important job of, like other Blaxploitations, its politics are complicated, but draws very much attention to the racism inherent to American systems. So I'm going to tell you right now, I'm about to read a very long quote. And usually I would never do this because you don't do that when you're talking. But sometimes somebody says something in the best way possible, and you say, great, let me give credit where credit is due, and I'll just show the quote. So, don't worry. Nicholas Flicker, who has written extensively on Black horror, says, quote, in fact, when I insist that we should care about Black horror films, I'm insisting that not even despite their demonization of Blackness, but because of it. Understanding this is key to truly loving these films. Because I think what these films are showing us is not that Black people are horrifying, but that Blackness is horrifying. That being Black is horrifying, that it feels scary to be Black. But this doesn't seem right. It feels scary to be Black because racism is scary, because racists are monstrous. But these films make Black people seem monstrous, right? Then Black horror does something more than show us Black suffering. It transforms that suffering into true monstrosity, where that means that it transforms it into something we can't fully understand. The remnants of anti-Blackness are revealed to be not merely fearful, but incomprehensible. Horror is the emotional register that most dutifully captures what anti-Blackness is, where that entails accepting its incomprehensibility, its monstrosity, in addition to its danger. This is what these films offer, a rare opportunity to truly feel the weight of anti-Blackness, to truly grasp it, namely by realizing that we cannot truly grasp it, that it feels too big to grasp, that it outstrips our capabilities. That recognition itself has an affect, a creeping sense of dread, a sublime crackling current, an uncanny rush of ineffable incomprehensibility, horror. End quote. It is not only in these personal ways where people find a sense of recognition. On larger scales, horror can be healing, or at least offer a collective space to recognize, experience it. So there are two examples I want to briefly look at to think about this. So the first is German Expressionism. German Expressionism is a film movement that lasted from about the 1920s to the late 20s, maybe 29. People get real nerdy and say Metropolis is the last true German Expressionist film. People who know a bit about history might see where this is going. This movement occurs post-World War I. When Germany is in ruins, inflation is high, a sense of nation and self are shattered, and bodies have piled up. World War I was an extremely violent war, and I know that might sound silly, but World War I saw the introduction of the machine gun, tanks, trench warfare, and chemical warfare via chlorine and mustard gas. So it was not only that people died, but they were dying in new ways that left the body itself unrecognizable. German Expressionists use strong visual mise-en-scène, so this is from Canada, Calgary here, and narratives that are often about disturbed mental spaces, disruptions to the norm, either society or psyche. And they're trying to work through a trauma of war which exists beyond words. The second example is Godzilla, the OG. Now, For any students that are ahead of me, you're like, yep, I know where this is going. That's fine. So the original Godzilla film was meant to be a film that reflected back to Japanese people the fear over nuclear war. Godzilla does not have scales. He has scars. And these scars look like the scars that were left on victims of the nuclear bombs. His head is shaped like a mushroom cloud. Due to American imperialism after World War II, it was not easy for many Japanese films to be direct about the Japanese experience. There's a lot of censorship that was happening. And even though the film comes out post America actually being there, the kind of coding through this creature feature shows us the kind of anxiety that was being lived and that needed to be worked through. So speaking of traumatic events, so COVID, we have a modern example of the way that people often turn to horror when they need a sense of relief, when they need to be healed. So yeah, in 2020, Farah Muhammad noted that the video games, Doom Eternal, Neo, and Resident Evil all saw really high download numbers in the last few months of 2020. Now, you may remember that in 2020, we were doing a thing called lockdown. We were quarantining to prevent a mass outbreak, trying to prevent a mass killer, an unseen one, an unknown disease. And yet, people turned to narratives about zombies who had contracted unknown, unseen diseases. Samantha Fox makes a compelling case that video games like these have a meaningful psychological role. Quote, faced with the physical and psychological dangers, human beings imagine them as monsters and seek to master them. We could not master COVID. We are still not mastering COVID, but we can shoot a zombie in the head. They make known the unknown and name the nameless. In doing so, they domesticate our fears. Also, the study also showed that over 7,000 players, out of 7,000 players, 68% reported that something like DayZ, which is another zombie thing, was mildly or very cathartic. As a film historian interested in horror, and this is not surprising at all how many people turned to zombies during the lockdown. The mass grief happening demanded media that allowed us to see other people go through hell and survive. We needed something that would tell us it would eventually end or that we could eventually win. Horror does something else in terms of its healing. It offers spiritual and moral guidance. So horror serves an important community and self-function in that it serves similar functions as religion or spirituality. For instance, horror helps us think about our impact on community. In the Ojibwe knowledge, the Wendigo represents a threat of overindulgence and how it is detrimental to the community. Early modern playwrights used the bubonic plague as an analogy for selfishness, which is not unlike Romero's Dawn of the Dead or They Live. This gets back to that didactic purpose horror has in providing guidelines for us. But horror shares another overlap with religion in that both of them deal with the all, as an AWE, not the thing you look at when you see a cat, like, the all and the awful, or what some refer to as this tense relationship between dread and desire. In the same study by Samantha Fox, she says that, quote, the typical response to an encounter with the divine is the ambivalent one. The religious person experiences both fear and love. We revel in fear because we believe that our salvation lies somewhere inside it, end quote. Both horror and spirituality also offer a sense of community, the ability to transcend the material world. Horror fans have rituals. Many horror films are referred to as cult films, not because the narratives are cultish, but because the practices of watching them are. So many devotee horror fans force other people to watch them. It's why I became a film professor, if I'm being honest. I get to force other people to watch the horror films I like. So there is this ritualistic community element to horror. I just like nobody's really doing that with drama. Nobody's sitting down and being like, hey, we gotta watch Saving Private Ryan. I hope people are doing that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Very clear versions of the ritualism, things like Rocky Horror. But they also become ritualistic in a person's personal viewing. It's not uncommon for many horror fans to rewatch horror as their comfy movie, as their comfort watch. How can the visceral be comfy? Because we know what happens. Horror is a genre built on such specific conventions that it's easily knowable. And the fact that I mean, if you've ever hung out with like a 3-year-old, they just want to watch the same thing over and over and over again. Guess what? We're just big 3-year-olds. So horror provides that space to connect to community through shared ritualistic practices that often involve that tension between the dread and desire. They often give somebody a sense of status. I am this. I am a horror fan. This immediately gives you an in with other people. I'm going to say this. I'm going to say it with love. Horror fans have got to be the most annoying movie fans out there. And I say that because I'm one of them. But there is this immediate sense of you say you're a horror fan, we are immediately BFFs and we're going to trade all knowledge in this moment. The other important thing that happens that can be healing, and I couldn't think of a picture, like I was just gonna put my body up there, so is body reaction. So the other important thing is that horror is what we would call a body genre. This means that much like melodrama and pornography, it is defined as horror because of what it does to the body. In the book, The Body Keeps the Score, the author states that, quote, traumatized people chronically feel unsafe in their bodies. The past is alive in the form of a gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs. In an attempt to control these processes, they often become experts at ignoring their gut feeling and a numbing awareness that is played out inside. They learn to hide from themselves, end quote. Like trauma, horror doesn't live in the mind, it lives in the body. And it makes our body be listened to. Our adrenaline spikes, our heart races, we sweat, we cry, we might vomit. Horror, by its generic conventions, forces us to be deeply aware of our body. Or maybe not fully aware, but at least momentarily connected to it. But here's the trick. This connection to the body reaffirms the fact that you exist. You feel things, that you are. So horror is healing, but healing is horror. I just put things that healing. So we got Vincent Price, OG, horror, and then we got Paddington Bear. I mean, so we also need to reframe how we discuss healing itself. Healing yourself at the end is usually totally very, very worth it. The process is horrific at times. One of the scariest choices a person can make is to say, I need or want to be different. As an undergrad, I too often assumed that my academic abilities were a direct result of being mentally unwell. That I could read things or see things or feel things because of the way I existed. Sure, I self-harmed, was depressed, and forgot to eat, but I got straight A's, so those had to be connected, right? To get well, to heal, meant I didn't know who I was going to be at the end anymore. I didn't know if I'd still get straight A's. And this isn't a unique story. This is often what keeps people from seeking help. The bullshit narrative of the tortured artist. So often our narratives around healing are yoga from an open window or self-care capitalism of bubble baths. The horror and the fear of the unknown different self is real. But true healing can, in fact, be horrific, and people should know that. Medications change the body. EMDR makes the body and mind reconnect, but what happens when it reconnects? You can be asked to relive trauma over and over again, especially if you have to like move or your insurance changes, and then you have to go see a therapist, and so you got to do the whole cake poodle again. Other therapies make your body leaky. I lied. There was one more leaky. Horror films can act as a form of exposure therapy. In fact, it's not uncommon for people who have been sexually assaulted to watch the subgenre of rape revenge. Healing is not linear, and so you're stuck in an unknown, unknowable process. Healing is a form of horror, much like horror films. The unpleasantness can make for a more pleasant daily experience. And so while healing is horrific, it's worth doing. So the conclusion, the too long didn't read version of this would be that we need to feel like we can face monsters, that we can overcome things that might not be overcomable, like the housing crisis, economics, racism, sexism, homophobia, misogyny, misogynoir, natural disasters. So many horrors are outside of our control that horror allows us a sense of control. In doing so, it offers a form of self-reflection, community, and healing. So I flipped that one in there. Thank you. Please ask questions. Don't you do you. No, I haven't probably seen that thing. You can ask anyways. Totally fine. Thanks. I'm also leaky right now and I'm like very sweaty. So please don't come up to me after that. I'm not gonna start with you, even though I know we made direct eye contact, Frankie. Damn it. Yes.
So I noticed you skipped the 70s as far as horror genre. Where does that fit in with the timeline?
I did very broadly, like 60s to 80s. That 70s is actually my favorite time of horror. I mean, that's where we're getting The Exorcist, we're getting Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we're getting Daughters of Darkness, we're getting actually a whole lot of lesbian vampire erotica films that are really short-lived, but boy howdy are they a fun ride. So the 70s is probably late 60s to about 83-ish is when I would say we have those huge social changes. And so horror in that genre is some of the most, I think, experimental. It's the most interesting. We're also getting films like this film called Ganja and Hess that paints vampirism not as, like, they never use the word vampire. They call it bloodlust. So it winds up being more associated with disease than traditional vampire narratives. And so the 70s is this really amazing sort of explosive time, which makes sense because everything was so sort of in the air in the 70s. Who do you trust? Not the government, that's for sure. I mean, I still feel that. I mean, that hasn't gone away, I guess. But and so the 70s, I think, are some of why we get some of the most politically charged. Like I would say 1968, Night of the Living Dead sets a new way in which horror films are going to really confront these systems, because there's really no way, if you've ever watched Night of the Living Dead, there's no way to watch the end and not sort of see its connections to civil rights, to anti-Blackness. From then on, yeah, it's a lot of like, nothing is sacred. And part of this is also because the production code is gone, so they're like, oh, we can show boobs and blood. We're doing it. So, thank you, Frankie.
Well, I was going to say, so in one of Jamie's classes, actually, we're reading Marquise de Sole Man. It's talking about horror films at the end and kind of the use in using kind of film and fiction generally as a way to be embodied and like feel what is happening to you and not kind of have an explanation for everything. And I was also thinking about kind of connecting that then to the way that like capitalism co-ops forms of expression or artistic expression, and kind of like where you see the intersect happening, like particularly with the rise of this idea of like art horror, of this need to take horror and make it something special that specifically does a task, as opposed to kind of that like experiencing and feeling without necessarily using it. There's a question there somewhere.
Sure, I'll believe you. You're querying what is question.
Yeah.
This turn to art horror is also our need to feel smart. That I think it goes back to this idea that like, oh, or if I watch something like Midsummer, I know these, I'm not shitting on these songs, but like if I watch something like Hereditary or Midsummer, I can cognitively read this.
Yeah.
And yet, that's what horror's always done. It's always been a readable, legible text. And I think too often do people associate the concept of horror as a cognitive thing. But to me, the most important thing horror does is force us to encounter our body in ways that are quite unpredictable and uncontrollable. Even when you know you like or react badly to certain kinds of horror, sometimes a horror film can sneak up and punch you in the face in ways you weren't expecting. I'm sorry to my intro to film students I made watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because I believe some of them got really punched in the face. But at the end of it, we had a beautiful sort of discussion. The other good thing is, yeah, I think capitalism itself also wants us to be disconnected from our body. Don't work less and make yourself a good meal. Just go buy something. Just go eat a cheese stick and a Bang energy drink. I'm not talking from experience at all today. But yeah, that disconnect is 100% on purpose. And I think horror is a way in which we wind up getting to like fight back against that. To take pleasure, to take time to think about our body. Other yeah.
This is more so.
Sure.
I just wanted to say you put words to a really big part of my identity. I really appreciate it. Like, this was just a great investigation.
Why did you not come smoking to me in my office? Sorry, this is please come to my office. It's 201 Fawcett. I have a mini fridge full of cheese sticks, snacks. Please stop by and talk to me more. But that means a lot to me. And now I'm gonna go out in my car and both cry and scream.
Alex, I mean, just before doing this now, I would like to talk to you too.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Do that later
No, your person is allowed to set office hours. Like, Ty.
Celeste, I was wondering, I mean, your talk, of course, was about film, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship, I mean, if there is one, between, say, like literary horror, so, horror novels or short stories, and if they track together, because you're giving the preview of like the different eras of film horror. I'm kind of wondering, like, how does literary horror trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, some of it definitely overlaps. But I'm, the cool kids study film, Ty, and the losers study literature. No, I think it's interesting. They're different kinds. They're different kinds of pleasures. Like you can't only read a novel so fast, and in that, I mean, if you're doing it properly, like you can only read a novel so fast, and in that, like there is a kind of like anticipation that you are really being controlled by the sentence length, the paragraphs, the structure. Whereas film has an entirely different language. Like film doesn't have to rely on dialogue. It has mise en scène, cinematography, editing, and sound. And so I think in some ways, and this is so my bias, and I'm so sorry, but I think in some ways I find like audiovisual media can often put our experiences out there in a way that literature can't always, because literature is fundamentally based on language, and language often fails horror. Like it's one of the few areas in which I think like I feel I get real snobby about like film does it better. But I think part of it is just because like they're working like literary texts are so limited in some ways. I don't mean that negative, and please push back against that. Because like I mean I just feel a kind of horror when I read like Poe, for instance. It does get inside of me. I do feel creeped out.
You don't leap out of your seat.
Yeah, I've never like read a novel and like felt like I was gonna vomit. Not for scary reasons. I mean, maybe not for other reasons, but not for like those same reasons. And so I think there is a sort of pleasure in the body from reading. I think it's just a very different embodied experience of horror. Thank you. Do you need to set off with her?
And that's what I think for me personally, because when you flashed the scary stories to read in the dark and Goosebumps, I was like, oh my God, I've been childhood. And I am terrified when I watch film because it's someone showing me something. But yet when I read, I can both take my time and it's a slow burn, but it's also really intimate and I can imagine things in a way. Yeah. That someone else is not showing.
Yeah, I would say like what they have is so there's a concept in horror that like everything I've just said is also sort of built on like the idea of like what we call the tolerance threshold. That there is a point in which something is so distressing that it no longer like it goes beyond our tolerance threshold. I think what's so interesting is the way that what kinds of level of control you're trying to feel. Because you can technically stop a film. You can walk away. Don't do what some of my students tell me. And they're like, I watched the movie on 2.5 speed. Don't. What a destructive thing you've done to yourself. But we're much more okay with novels are meant to be sort of returned to, whereas films do feel like a much more sort of like time, like you are forced to watch this thing in this sitting. Although I think people are having different like my mom would be like, yeah, we're gonna watch the rest of the movie tonight. I'm like, how do you do that? People should do whatever they want. But that sense of control is a super important paper.
I agree with that, and on novels versus films and how they evoke different types of horror. I remember having a discussion with Ruth last semester about the reasons why films can make you feel more body things in different ways is because of the audio. Because sound gets in your body.
Yeah.
You can close your eyes and take a break from
Yeah.
it, but you can't really close your ears.
Yeah.
So I think that's why it's very different for me.
Well, it's really, and like I often tell students, like, if you want to watch a horror movie and you don't want it to be scary, turn the sound off. If you think about something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, sorry, I just taught it tonight, so it's like real first on the brain. Most of the horror comes from the sound. There's also things about sound that we can't hear audibly, but we can feel in the body, certain frequencies, and it's theorized. And I'm saying theorized because Hollywood, and especially Hollywood horror legends, the wild, nobody knows what's true. There is a theory that the paranormal activity movies use a particular frequency of sound that we cannot hear, but that we can feel. And so the way in which sound becomes is really important. And I spent a lot, I'm currently writing a chapter about closed captions in horror film. And like they're terrible. Like ominous music only gets you so far. People deserve better. So the audio, yeah, super important. Frankie.
Yeah, kind of building on Fitch's point, like the idea of like there's this level of connection. There are levels of connection that you have to something. So like walking through a haunted house is like full total embodiment. You cannot escape it. Well, I mean, you can sort of, but you have to go through it to get out. Whereas, you know, if you're watching film, that's kind of like a step back. Everything is seen and projected for you. You don't have to do the mental effort of imagining it, but you are forced to still deal with it again, like visually and audibly, and kind of sensorily, like sensationally as well. And I think what it is with books is like it's another level of separation, and that you're having to do that mental work of making those images. And I think it still like produces really meaningful, like it's meaningful work. I love reading. But yeah, I feel like they create these different levels of connection, and depending on what you need. I think something about horror is like a lot of the things that horrify us come from some kind of lack of control over that situation. And I could be totally projecting, but it's like there's something that's happening that in some way you can't change and make and stop or do yourself, like you can't control it. And so film like captures that in a way that like
It's just different.
It's just
like I don't think
it's not capturing it. It's like, yeah, it's different than walking through a haunted house. They're each just like different, but they do those things differently. And I think with literature, when you're forced still to kind of like imagine it, it's a kind of different kind of scary too.
Yeah.
When you're like, oh, my brain is doing some real weird things right now.
Oh, I remember 2 books that I stopped reading as a child and had to return to as an adult. One of them was the Goosebumps. It's the one with the dogs. It's the Phantom Ghost Dogs. And I don't know what it was with Phantom Ghost Dogs, but my little brain cannot handle it. And the other one was a Nancy Drew book. So in that book, I mean, and it's so interesting. I very much viscerally remember being so freaked out as a kid that I was like, no, thank you. And then I have finished them now. I overcame my fear. Yeah. And I think for kids, it is really like, I genuinely like, part of me, all right, I'm about to be like grumpy old man on the lawn, shaking his fist at the sky. And part of me is like, bring back dark childhood movies. We need to traumatize children a little bit safely again. Where is our never ending story? Where is Dark Crystal? Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the category of horror as a critique of capitalism.
Sure.
And like, I guess I'm wondering, can horror films really do that? Because if the sense of alienation or the sense of, anxiety and stress and my body being in pain and my needs not being able to be met, and how do I pay for this and that kind of like constant sense of vulnerability to death, right? How can horror really enable us to recognize that or overcome that if it is something that we're being entertained by as a commodity? And how is that how does, well, like, how does horror do that, and how does it do it well? Like, it seems like it can't be art horror. Right?
I mean, yeah,
It can't-
I had my own.
I guess that's my
Yeah.
question, is like, that's what some people think. They think
Mhm.
when horror becomes art, it does more than something that commodified horror can do, right? And I don't get what that is. Like, I don't understand what that is. So I'm wondering,
What's the in that sense?
the horror that legitimately critiques capitalism, that is like not commodifiable, that can't be just turned in to just a reiteration of or justification of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this, first of all, thanks for asking me a super hard question at the end of the thing, Jamie. No, I think part of this is, can it be a critique of capitalism if we're entertained by it? I do think so, because I think that there's nothing sort of more anti-capitalist than taking time for just pleasure. And I'm not saying that films themselves don't exist outside of a capitalist system. Of course they do. I mean, unless you're only watching the horror films that your friends made on VHS, like VHS was made within a capitalist system, all these things. So for me, it has more to do with like this recognition that my body needs to experience horror, and fulfilling that need to me does feel sort of like a fuck you. Especially, I'm not gonna lie, the lower brow, and the more sort of distasteful the horror is, the more exciting I tend to find it. Yeah. So my queer horse needs to just watch Sleepaway Camp. I'm not gonna ruin it for anybody, but it's pretty low brow. I mean, there is a reason that horror is considered akin to pornography. And to me, what they both are doing is giving us the space to just exist as bodies, to feel as bodies. And I think like that to me, like, yeah, I think it's one of those things like, no, we can't escape
Like
capitalism.
in
But
like Fall of the House of Usher, the series version.
I had a lot of non. Go ahead.
Jamie loves it.
I don't love it. It's not because I'm about to critique it. The very last episode, they have to put the critique of capitalism in its mouth.
I see, yeah.
Rather than it be like, let us show you, or let us express.
Okay.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay,
Is like,
yeah.
how's it expressed rather than making the character say it.
Yeah, I think that there's something like, okay, so the example I go to, and we can totally talk about like it's because like the house in the Fall House abstraction, it's an actual house. Anyways, so Anna Miller's The Love Witch. Something that I think is so sort of important about that film is not only is it low budget, not only is it shot on film stock, which nobody's doing anymore, it's also that she like handmade so much in the film. And I would say like, although it's not a direct, it's dealing more with sort of gender in different ways, but the fact that like it's not this sort of like mass budget, it's like a return to women's handiwork. And to me, that feels deeply sort of disconnected from sort of capitalistic practices, despite the film not being about capitalism. I think that the fact that like, I mean, Anna, just so you know, she lives on Twitter and she needs to stop. It's not good. She wrote a not great novel, but The Love Witch, like she crocheted a lot of it, she painted a lot of the things. And so for me, the most exciting things are things like that. But I also love, like, I'm not gonna lie, John Carpenter's They Live, like, it's not subtle, but it's fun. And I think even that sort of can get us closer to sort of, I agree with you, like, I do not enjoy, like, if you just tell me that, like, this thing, capitalism bad, okay, but show me in practice where that is in your film, things like handicrafts or low budget, or I would rather see messy prosthetic applications than like CGI. Like all of me, like, to me, all of those things are a resistance of neatness, tidiness, and capitalism. Does that answer it? I think one more, you can set office hours. Two more, I lied, because over there, yeah.
I recently watched with a couple friends Terrifier 3.
Yeah.
And it's like a unrated killer clown movie, and legitimately this guy just tries to kill people
Yeah.
in the worst way possible. And they try to show it like everything in like gory detail.
Yeah.
And I've never seen a Terrifier movie. I didn't watch horror growing up, and I walked in blind. And it was
Whoa.
yeah. It was probably one of the craziest things I've ever seen in my entire life.
your friends and not, we need to have it.
And it was all part of like, I guess, I like horror and this is like how it makes you feel. And naturally Terrifier is such a horrible movie that like you feel so many different emotions at so many different times. And I wonder if there's something to be said about like me going with my friends to watch that and like the entire theater screaming at once when something happens. So, like all of us like engaged, like, no, don't do that, don't go there. You know?
Yes, this is the thing. Sorry. This is the thing I love about horror. And when I started to get to when I said like there's a ritualistic community aspect of horror, is horror is a genre that so opens you up and is one of the only like you can't in a musical be like tap dance. Like, we can't. Like, that's not gonna be normalized. But with horror, it's almost like I always talk like horror is meant to be seen in community because you're meant to feed off of each other's energy. You're meant to yell and go, oh my god, why? And it's exactly that reason that is a genre unlike really any other in that. And that sense of community is so deeply meaningful. I'm happy it sounds like you have community despite your friend's mild hazing. We're actually out of time, but I'll hang out for a minute if anybody wants to talk about anything. But again, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And next week at 4 o'clock on Wednesday, we have Owen Edgington. We'll be talking about imagination as a political act. Solar punk visions of Hendrix College.
Perfect.
Next week.